Until now, we reviewed some of the basics of writing a function. Now, in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about value returning functions. But before going to that, I would like to talk about the top-down design, which is what we use quite a bit in designing programs using function. As I mentioned previously, functions are great tools in order to let us break down a program into a set of subtasks that can be done independently, and then that will help breaking down a complex program into a set of more simple tasks. The process that we're breaking down a complex program into subtasks is called decomposition, and we usually use a diagram called hierarchy chart that depicts the relationship between the functions. So basically each function has a box, and we use a set of lines in order to connect and show how these functions basically build on top of each other and what are the steps that together help us understand a more complex problem. This is an example of a hierarchy chart. So we usually have a main function. Main function is classically used in order to run the main function of the program. So that's what developers usually use. In this simple example, we want to have a set of program where we're calculating the employee's salary, but we are breaking down into this question into a set of subtasks. First, we have a function that receives input, the hours worked and the hourly rate. We define another function that calculates the gross pay. We have another function that calculates overtime if there's any. Another one would look at the taxes and withholding and benefits. So there are subtasks to that. And then we have another function that's calculating net pay. And all of those can be combined together in a main function that together help us solve a problem. So basically what we do is in hierarchy chart, we show how each of these are related to each other. We don't really show the code in hierarchy chart, but we show the steps that are related to these subtasks and how they build on top of each other in order to define a main function. I want to also talk about value returning functions a little bit more. Previously, we talked about the type of functions that don't return any value. Example would be when we're defining a function that will just simply print a statement, but sometimes we need to return a value from a function, and this is important. In order to write a value returning function, what we do is that we write all the statements that we do usually in our function. We have parameters, we have all the statements, and what we do is that we use return and the value or the variable that we have in mind. And what we can think about this is that together this function, once this function goes through, this is the value that's going to come out of it. So we can think about all of these steps summarized in terms of this return value. So we will run a few examples shortly after this. So value returning functions can be useful in specific situations when anytime a function prompts the user to input and wants to return that input. Let's say we want that value to be used in another function or another statement, and this will help basically assign that return value. When we use return, we're assigning that value into a variable that will come out of that function, basically. This is an example of a simple function. So let's say we have defined a function called getName, and this basically receives an input from the user, and what we do is that we return that value. So when a user runs this function, when this function is called, that value is going to come out of that function. So again, this is slightly different from when we had a printing statement. Now, what are the example of values that come out of a function? We can have numbers coming out of it, we can have strings, we can have variables, we can also have Boolean statements. So we can have a function that, let's say, checks a condition and makes a decision and returns either true or false as an outside of that statement. So let's run a few examples. I am going to define a simple statement, simple function. I'm just going to call it defined return x, and what we want to do, we are giving it a parameter. So let's say a simple statement would be like this. So what we do is that, let's just call this function quickly and see what happens. So we say return x, and I'm going to say return print 2. So if I do that, I'm going to have a value called 2. But also, instead of printing, which is just displaying the value, imagine we want to do something with this. We want to, let's say we want to say y is equal to x times 10. And now what we do is that we want to return this value. I'm going to return y. So let's see what happens. Now, the function is not going to print anymore. So we turn that into a comment. So we should receive a statement. We should receive a value that's 2. And it's going to be, let's say, multiplied by 10. And the return value should be 20. So what happened is that now x come in here, 2 is going to be called, and then it's multiplied by 20, and now returning the value, right? So if I wanted to, let's say, now I can do other things with it. I can say print return 10, and I can do other statements with it, right? So multiply 10 by 10 and add it to 10. So this is an example of where we want to have a return function. Now, it is possible to have more than one value coming out of it, of a function, but it's important to know that we are separating these values by comma, and the order that these values come out matter quite a bit. So when we call a function, the return value is going to be 2. Let's run another example where we are defining a function. I'm just going to say, call this function adding, and I'm going to say receive 2 values. It has 2 parameters, and total is equal to a plus b, and then return total. So that's when we have single statement. Let's just call it and see how this function would work. I'm just going to say adding, call this, and I call it 2 and 3. So when I do that, that value is going to be printed, but I can also have multiple values coming out of it. Let's say I want to have total, I want to have a, and I also want to see b. So now when I'm calling this function again, not only I'm getting value 5, but I'm also receiving all of these values within the parentheses. So this is an example of where we want to have multiple expressions. And now you can, for instance, receive these values and assign it to another, let's say, variable. Or even use it as an input to another function. That's also quite possible.